A drill pressed into Greenland ice in 2013 pulled up something the analyst did not immediately expect. At a depth corresponding to exactly 12,800 years ago, platinum concentrations spiked to 3 times their normal background level. The same thin anomaly appeared across multiple cores drilled at separate locations across the ice sheet. Same depth, same chemical signature, same moment sealed in ancient snow. Platinum is rare near Earth's surface. Most of it sank to the planet's core billions of years ago, or arrived later, carried in from somewhere beyond our atmosphere. That quiet chemical spike, preserved in frozen layers no thicker than a few centimeters, sits at the precise beginning of a period scientists call the Younger Dryas. What placed it there is still genuinely debated. The Younger Dryas lasted roughly 1,200 years, from about 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, and it should not have happened. Earth had been warming steadily for thousands of years. The great ice sheets of the last glacial maximum were retreating northward. Ecosystems were shifting, recovering, expanding. Then something intervened, and the planet fell back toward a glacial cold in what the ice record suggests took not centuries, but decades, perhaps a single human lifetime, perhaps less. Tonight we follow 3 traces through that interval. We will move through the physical evidence, the nanodiamonds, the platinum anomalies, the magnetic spherules, the black carbon-rich layers that appear across sites from the American Southwest to the Syrian desert, that some researchers read as the fingerprint of a comet impact or a fragmenting meteorite. We will consider what the ocean's own slow machinery may have done without any help from the sky. And we will ask what the Megafauna Extinction and the sudden disappearance of the Clovis culture can tell us, if anything, about what actually ended that vanished world. These are not questions with settled answers. The case for something extraterrestrial striking the Laurentide ice sheet 12,800 years ago is real enough to have appeared in serious scientific journals proposed by serious researchers with serious data. It is also contested rigorously, specifically by other researchers who travelled to the same sediment layers, used the same instruments and found different things, or read the same things differently. Science at its edges often looks like this 2 groups of careful people staring at the same thin stripe of ancient dirt and arriving at opposite conclusions. What both sides agree on is more striking than their disagreement. The Younger Dryas happened, the megafauna disappeared. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears, saber-toothed cats, an entire bestiary that had ranged across North America for millions of years vanished from the fossil record within a few centuries of each other, and within a few centuries of the cold. The Clovis toolkit, those elegantly fluted spear points, some of the finest stonework in all of pre-Columbian prehistory, stops appearing in new sediment layers at almost exactly the same moment. The dispute is not about whether these things happened, it is about the mechanism, about whether the force that broke the world came down from space or built slowly from within the planet's own grinding interior. In 1994, astronomers watched Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 break into more than 20 distinct fragments before striking Jupiter. The impact scars those fragments carved into the gas giant's atmosphere were in some cases larger than the entire Earth. That event, observed in real time, is now used as a reference. What might a similar fragmentation have looked like incoming, aimed at a continent buried under 2 miles of ice, in an era before any human had instruments, archives, or even a word for what was descending? That question more than the data alone is what keeps the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis alive in the scientific literature, even as critics have raised serious and specific objections to its evidence. The hypothesis was formally proposed in 2007 by a team led by nuclear physicist Richard Firestone. Their cited evidence was concrete nanodiamonds, recovered from a thin sediment layer at sites in Pennsylvania, South Carolina, California, Belgium, and Syria, always the same depth, always the same age. Magnetic spherules bearing signs of exposure to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. A platinum or platinum spike, and the black mat itself, that carbon-rich boundary layer running across dozens of archaeological sites marking the line where the Clovis world ends and something quieter and smaller begins. Against this other, researchers have argued that collapsing item dams, freshwater pulses roaring into the North Atlantic, and a disrupted ocean conveyor belt were more than sufficient that the climate system needed no visitor from space to tip itself into cold, that the megafauna already weakened by a warming climate fragmenting their grasslands needed only the additional pressure of human hunters moving through a continent whose animals had never learned to fear a small, upright, coordinated primate, that the platinum, the spherules, the nanodiamonds all have quieter explanations: volcanic activity, ordinary wildfires, geological processes stretched across centuries rather than minutes. Neither story is simple on its own, neither is yet complete, and the most careful voices in this debate tend to speak not in the language of proof, but in something softer, in what the sediment layers suggest, in what the climate models allow, in what remains for now, just beyond the resolution of our instruments. So we begin where the evidence begins, in the ice, in the cold, in a thin, bright striae of platinum, sealed inside Greenland snow 12,000 years ago, waiting patiently for a question it cannot quite yet answer, and we follow the traces from there. The world before the break. On the eastern edge of what would one day become the Great Plains, approximately 13,000 years ago, a woman is processing a hide in the thin light of early morning. She is not the first person to have sat in this place. Her people have been moving through this landscape for generations, following the slow rhythms of herds too large to count tracking migration corridors that have not yet been given names. The ground beneath her is cold. To the north, visible on clear days, the horizon carries a faint bluish luminescence. Light, reflecting off ice walls so massive that the land beneath them is still today slowly rising from their weight. Parts of what we now call Canada are ascending by several millimeters every year, still recovering from compression that ended more than 10 millennia ago. The ice was that heavy. The world at that moment was that different. This is where the story begins, not with catastrophe but with abundance. The late Pleistocene, in the centuries just before 12,800 years ago, was not the bleak, barren landscape that the word Ice Age tends to conjure. It was a world of extraordinary biological richness, especially at the margins where retreating glaciers met the open steppe. Glacial meltwater-fed river systems carrying the mineral loads that turned floodplains into some of the most productive grasslands the continent had ever seen. Less evaporation in the colder air meant more available surface water. Seasonal freeze preserved organic material rather than letting it decompose, building soils of unusual fertility that exploded into growth during brief but intense summers. The result was a landscape that could sustain animals of almost unimaginable size, in numbers that modern ecosystems have no equivalent for. Columbian mammoths stood 14 feet at the shoulder and weighed up to 10 tons. Their tusks could reach 16 feet in length, not ornamental but functional tools for stripping bark levers, for moving fallen timber instruments, for displacing snow to reach the vegetation beneath. American mastodons moved through the forests with their cone-shaped teeth, browsers rather than grazers, following a different ecological niche from their mammoth relatives with quiet precision. Giant ground sloths, some approaching 4 tons in body mass, reared on their hind legs to reach branches that no other terrestrial mammal could access. Their claws, long, recurve, capable of splitting hardwood, were probably defensive as much as foraging tools. An adult giant sloth, fully grown, may have had very few natural enemies. And that is where the quiet problem begins, because the predators that existed alongside these giants were themselves extraordinary. Short-faced bears stood 12 feet tall when upright, with long limbs built not for digging, but for running possibly the fastest large carnivore to ever move across the North American continent. Saber-toothed cats carried canine teeth, not as display but as precision instruments engineered over millions of years to deliver killing bites to the throats of prey far larger than themselves. Dire wolves hunted in coordinated packs with bone-crushing jaw strength, capable of processing femurs and spines that modern wolves would leave behind. American lions, larger by a quarter than any African lion alive today, ranged across open country with a territorial breadth that required vast productive landscapes to sustain. This was not a world in decline. It was a world near its peak. The humans who moved through it understood this in the way that people who have lived within an ecosystem for generations understand it without needing to name it. The Clovis people are a name that refers not to a single tribe, but to a technological tradition, a way of shaping stone that spread across the continent with unusual speed, were not scavengers at the edge of survival. They were skilled, organized, and deeply knowledgeable. Their projectile points, the fluted spear tips first identified near Clovis to New Mexico, are works of deliberate craft, symmetrical aerodynamic with grooves running up both faces that allowed secure hafting to wooden shafts. Modern knappers trained specifically in the technique struggle to replicate them consistently. The Clovis people made these by the thousand from stone. They transported hundreds of miles from known quarry sites, evidence of trade networks, seasonal movements, or both. They hunted cooperatively. Archaeological kill sites show multiple large animals taken simultaneously, butchered in sequence, with every recoverable portion of bone, fat, and hide either consumed or carried away. These were not opportunistic encounters. They were planned operations executed by people who knew their prey's behavior, movement patterns, and vulnerabilities with the intimacy that comes from generations of observation. The world, in other words, was working, climate was warming, ice was retreating. New territory was opening in the north following the glacial margins, and the megafauna were moving into it, colonizing newly exposed ground, spreading seeds in their dung, maintaining open grassland corridors that fed the next generation of herds in self-reinforcing cycles. Earth's orbital mechanics, the slow oscillation of its tilt and the shape of its path around the sun, suggested this trend would continue for thousands of years. Prior interglacial periods had followed similar patterns. Along steady warming ecosystems, shifting northwards at a pace that species could track a gradual replacement of ice, with tundra and tundra, with forest and forest, with the complex mixed landscapes of a fully interglacial world. That is what the pattern predicted. That is what, by all the evidence of previous cycles, should have happened next. Something else happened instead, and its signature, when researchers finally learned to read it, turned out to be written not in rock or pollen or bone, but in the chemistry of ancient ice in thin layers of frozen precipitation that had been falling quietly since before any of this began. What the ice remembers. The Greenland ice sheet is not a static object. It is an archive, one of the most precise climate records the planet has produced, built from 2 miles of compacted snowfall, laid down layer by layer across hundreds of thousands of years. Each winter's precipitation carries within it a chemical signature of the atmosphere. At the moment it fell, the ratio of oxygen isotopes locked into each water molecule, the dust and pollen trapped between crystals, or the trace gases sealed in microscopic air bubbles before the snow compressed into ice. Scientists who drill into this archive can read it the way a careful reader moves through a dense and difficult text, slowly, with attention to detail, aware that a single anomalous line may contain more information than the 50 lines surrounding it. And what those ice cores show at the depth corresponding to approximately 12,800 years ago is not a gradual shift. It is something closer to a cliff edge. In the layers just below that boundary, the chemical indicators tell a story of progressive warming. Oxygen isotope ratios consistent with milder temperatures, reduced dust loads suggesting less exposed glacial sediment being carried by wind, pollen signatures drifting northward as a plant communities track the retreating cold. Then, within a span of layers so thin that some researchers have estimated the transition unfolded over a single decade, perhaps less, everything changes. The isotope ratios plunge, dust concentrations spike. The pollen record shifts from oak and elm to pine to tundra grasses to a small Arctic flower called Dryas octopetala, a plant that hugs the ground against windswept cold, whose sudden proliferation across European sediment cores gave this entire period its name. The Younger Dryas in the ice record does not ease in. It arrives. What makes this transition so difficult to explain through ordinary climate mechanics is the question of speed. Earth's major climate cycles, the glacial and interglacial periods that have alternated across the last 2 million years, are driven primarily by slow, predictable changes in the planet's orbital geometry, the eccentricity of its path around the sun, the tilt of its rotational axis, the wobble of that axis over tens of thousands of years. These are the Milankovitch cycles, and they operate on timescales of 20,000 to 100,000 years. Even the shorter climate fluctuations associated with volcanic activity or changes in ocean productivity tend to develop over centuries. A temperature drop of 8 to 10 degrees Celsius in Greenland occurring within a single human lifetime does not fit comfortably into any of these frameworks. The ice is recording something that the standard mechanisms do not readily produce. The asymmetry of the cooling adds another layer of difficulty. The northern hemisphere, particularly the region surrounding the North Atlantic, bore the full weight of the Younger Dryas. Temperature reconstructions from Greenland and northern Europe suggested drops of 8 to 10 degrees. Britain, which had been warming steadily, fell back into near glacial conditions within decades. Parts of North America experienced comparable shifts, but the southern hemisphere did not follow the same pattern. Some regions in the south actually warmed slightly during the Younger Dryas, or remained relatively stable. This hemispheric asymmetry is a significant constraint on any proposed mechanism. Whatever caused the event must be capable of striking the northern hemisphere hard while leaving the south comparatively untouched. A global driver reduced solar output, a major volcanic eruption casting dust into the upper atmosphere, would be expected to affect both hemispheres more or less equally. The pattern in the ice argues against this. The end of the Younger Dryas is in some ways even more startling than its beginning. After 1,200 years of sustained cold, the warming that finally terminated the event was rapid to a degree that challenges easy description. Some ice core analyses suggest that temperatures in Greenland may have risen by 10 degrees or more within a span of years, possibly within months, in some reconstructions of the data. The cold snapped off as abruptly as it had begun, and the ecosystems that had reorganized themselves around it were suddenly asked again to adapt at speed. The Younger Dryas was not a slow geological process that crept across the landscape over generations. It was, in the language of climate science, a rapid state change the system, flipping from one configuration to another, with a speed that suggests the crossing of a threshold rather than the gradual drift of a trend. The detail that sits uncomfortably in this picture, the one that refuses to be fully absorbed into any single explanatory framework, is the platinum. When analysts working with Greenland ice cores in 2013 measured trace element concentrations at the depth corresponding to 12,800 years ago, they found that platinum levels spiked to approximately 3 times the normal background values. The spike appeared in multiple cores drilled at different locations across the ice sheet, which rules out local contamination or isolated geological events. Platinum is rare near Earth's surface. The vast majority of the planet's platinum sank to the core billions of years ago during the early differentiation of the molten Earth. What platinum does appear in surface sediments typically arrive via meteoritic material, the slow continuous rain of cosmic dust and occasional larger objects that have been falling on Earth since its formation. A sudden sharp increase in platinum at a specific moment in time does not prove that something large arrived from space, but it raises the question, and the question is specific enough to require a specific answer. The ice in this sense is not delivering a conclusion. It is delivering a problem, a set of observations precise enough to rule out some explanations and carefully shaped enough to leave others open. The Younger Dryas began fast. It ended fast. It struck the northern hemisphere preferentially. It left a chemical anomaly in ancient frozen precipitation that points at minimum towards something unusual in the atmosphere of that moment. Whether that something was an extraterrestrial visitor, a cascade of internal climate dynamics, or some combination of forces that our models have not yet fully captured is the question that has occupied researchers for decades and remains as of now genuinely unresolved. What is not in question is that the world the ice records at 12,800 years ago looks on one side of that boundary almost nothing like the world it records on the other, and that the distance between them measured in time is very small indeed. The story that follows from that boundary is written not only in ice, but in stone in bone and in the particular kind of absence that appears in the archaeological record when a culture that was everywhere suddenly is not. Fire signatures and fallen stars. A sediment layer is not by itself dramatic. It is a band of compressed material, clay, silt, organic matter, mineral grains that accumulated on a lake bed or floodplain or cave floor over years or centuries, then was buried by subsequent layers until it became part of a stratigraphic column that geologists read the way a physician reads a scan looking for anomalies, for discontinuities, for the places where the normal pattern breaks and something else intrudes. Most sediment layers are unremarkable in this reading. They record ordinary time, the slow accumulation of windblown dust, the gradual settling of organic debris, the patient deposition of pollen from whatever plants happen to be flowering in the vicinity. But some layers record something else. They record moments, and the layer that sits at the boundary between the Clovis period and the Younger Dryas, at sites distributed across North America, Europe, and the Middle East, has been recording the same moment, the same narrow band of unusual chemistry for 12,800 years, waiting for someone with the right instruments to notice what it contains. The first thing researchers noticed was the carbon. Across dozens of archaeological and geological sites, the boundary layer is rich in microscopic charcoal particles and carbon spherules, tiny balls of amorphous carbon that form when organic material is subjected to extreme rapid heating. Charcoal itself is not unusual in the sediment record. Fires have been occurring naturally for as long as there has been vegetation to burn. What made the boundary layer's carbon signature unusual was its distribution and its character. The charcoal appeared simultaneously across sites separated by thousands of miles in concentrations that did not build gradually from underlying layers, but appeared abruptly as if deposited in a single event. And the carbon spherules, unlike the irregular fragments produced by ordinary wildfires, showed signs of having been exposed to temperatures between 2,200 and 2,400 degrees Celsius temperatures that ordinary forest fires, which typically peak below 1,000 degrees, cannot produce. Something had burned very hot very fast and apparently very widely at the same moment. The second anomaly was stranger still. Alan West and his colleagues examining sediment samples from an archaeological site in Arizona in 2007 found under electron microscopy something they initially struggled to account for: nanodiamonds. These are crystals of carbon measuring just a few nanometers across, far too small to see with the naked eye, or even with standard optical microscopes that form only under conditions of extreme pressure and temperature. The natural processes that produce nanodiamonds on Earth operate deep in the mantle over geological timescales under pressures that the surface never experiences. Finding them in surface sediments is, in the language one researcher used at the time, like finding a piece of the deep earth in your garden. West's team began examining samples from additional sites and found the same thing: a thin layer of sediment consistently dated to 12,800 years ago, containing nanodiamond concentration that appeared nowhere in the layers above or below it. The layer turned up in Pennsylvania, South Carolina, California, Belgium, and Syria, always at the same stratigraphic depth, always carrying the same chemical signature. The third anomaly was the magnetic spherules. These are microscopic spheres of iron and related metals that form when rock is vaporized by intense heat and then condenses rapidly in the atmosphere, cooling so quickly that the material freezes into perfect or near-perfect spherical shapes before it can crystallize into anything more complex. They are found at known impact sites around the world, most famously in the thin clay layer that marks the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, the moment 66 million years ago, when an asteroid ended the age of non-avian dinosaurs. The spherules in the Younger Dryas boundary layer showed evidence of exposure to temperatures exceeding 2,200 degrees Celsius, and their microscopic structure was consistent with rapid formation from vaporized material rather than any known volcanic or sedimentary process. They appeared like the nanodiamonds and the charcoal at multiple sites across the Northern Hemisphere, always in the same thin band, always at the same moment. What Richard Firestone and his colleagues proposed in 2007, when they assembled these threads into a formal hypothesis, was that the distribution and character of the boundary layer's contents could be explained by a single class of events: the encounter of Earth around 12,800 years ago, with the fragmented debris field of a disintegrating comet. A comet approaching the inner solar system would have been subjected to the tidal forces of the Sun and the gravitational influence of the large planet's forces, capable of fracturing a loosely consolidated body of ice and rock into dozens or hundreds of separate pieces. If Earth crossed the path of such a fragmented comet, the result would not be a single large impact, but a shower of smaller events, some striking the ground, many more exploding in the upper atmosphere in airbursts, similar in character to, but vastly larger than the 1908 Tunguska event over Siberia, where an object estimated perhaps 50 meters across exploded approximately 8 kilometers above the ground and flattened more than 2,000 square kilometers of forest without leaving a crater. An airburst of sufficient energy releases its force as thermal radiation and shockwaves across a wide area. It can ignite fires across thousands of square miles. It can scatter vaporized material through the upper atmosphere where it disperses across hemispheres before settling. It does not necessarily leave a hole in the ground. This last point became central to the hypothesis, because the absence of a confirmed impact crater matching the proposed date was the most immediate objection critics raised. Firestone's team argued that airbursts over the Laurentide ice sheet, the vast frozen mass that still covered most of Canada at that time, would leave no permanent surface structure because the ice itself would absorb and distribute the energy, then melt, carrying the evidence away in the floods that followed. They pointed to the possibility of multiple smaller impacts scattered across a wide area, craters either raised by subsequent glaciation or lying undiscovered beneath ocean floors or under remaining ice. And then, in 2018, a finding emerged that appeared to some researchers as the closest thing yet to a physical confirmation: a crater 31 kilometers across discovered, buried beneath the Hiawatha Glacier in northwest Greenland, using ice-penetrating radar surveys with impact debris present in ice samples taken from the vicinity. Initial analyses suggested the structure might date to approximately 12,800 years ago. Whether the Hiawatha crater is actually that old, or whether it predates the Younger Dryas by tens of thousands of years, as some subsequent studies have argued, remains a point of genuine and active scientific contention. What is not contested is the geography of the evidence. The boundary layer's unusual contents, the nanodiamonds, the spherules, the carbon anomalies, the platinum. The spike in the Greenland ice span multiple continents. They appear in the American Southwest and the European lowlands, in the sediments of Syrian archaeological sites, and in the compressed snowfall of a Greenland glacier. If these signals are all recording the same moment, the event that produced them was not local. It was by definition something that reached across the northern hemisphere in a single interval of time. Whether what reached across the hemisphere came from space from within the climate system, or from some combination of the two, is the question that the boundary layer poses without yet answering, and it is a question that the megafauna, had any of them survived, to be asked could not have helped us resolve. What the animals can tell us, however, is a different kind of story, one written not in chemistry but in disappearance, in the particular silence that falls over a fossil records when species that were everywhere are suddenly and permanently gone. The last herds. 35 genera of large mammals disappeared from North America in the space of a few thousand years, a span of time that sounds long until you set it against the 50 million years their lineages had already survived. Mammoths, mastodons, native horses, North American camels, giant ground sloths, glyptodonts with their armoured shells, the American lion, the short-faced bear, the dire wolf, whole branches of the tree of life, each representing millions of years of evolutionary refinement gone from the fossil record so completely that their absence reshapes the continent's ecology in ways we are still measuring today. The question of what killed them is in one sense deceptively simple. Something tipped populations that had been stable for millennia across a threshold from which they could not recover. The question that remains genuinely open is what that something was, and whether it arrived from outside the ecosystem or had been building within it for generations before anyone thought to look. The fossil record is by its nature an incomplete document. Bones preserve only under specific conditions, particular soil chemistry, specific burial circumstances, the absence of scavengers thorough enough to disperse the remains before sediment can cover them. This means that the apparent timing of a species' disappearance in the fossil record is always an underestimate of how recently it actually survived. The last known fossil of any animal is almost certainly not the last individual that lived. Statistical models designed to correct for this sampling bias have been applied to the North American megafauna extinctions, and their results suggest that the actual disappearances were even more concentrated in time than the raw fossil record implies, compressed into a window that in some analyses narrows to just a few centuries around the Younger Dryas boundary. Whether that compression reflects a single catastrophic event or the final stage of a longer decline that simply accelerated at the end is one of the questions the models cannot resolve on their own. What the fossil record does preserve with unusual clarity in certain locations is evidence of human activity alongside megafaunal remains. Clovis kill sites places where the association between human tools and animal bones is close enough in space and time to indicate deliberate hunting rather than opportunistic scavenging, show mammoths and mastodons butchered systematically with Clovis points occasionally embedded in bone or found within the scatter of a disarticulated carcass. These sites are not abundant. Confirmed kill sites where the evidence for direct human predation is unambiguous are surprisingly rare relative to the number of Clovis sites, known overall a fact that critics of the overkill hypothesis have returned to repeatedly. But rarity of direct evidence is not the same as rarity of the behaviour. Most kills leave no lasting archaeological trace at all, and the absence of embedded spear points in a bone bed does not mean the animal died without human assistance. The detail that lingers is this: in region after region across North America, the last megafaunal fossils and the first clear evidence of widespread human presence appear within the same narrow stratigraphic window. The overkill hypothesis, as developed most thoroughly by the ecologist Paul Martin in the latter decades of the 20th century, proposes that the arrival of Clovis hunters in a continent whose megafauna had never encountered a coordinated projectile, armed, cognitively sophisticated predator was itself sufficient to explain the extinctions. Animals that had evolved no instinctive fear of humans, no behavioural response to the sight of a small biped approaching across open ground, would have been unusually vulnerable during the initial contact period. Slow reproducing species, those that raised only a few offspring over a lifetime and required years to reach sexual maturity, would have been particularly susceptible. A modest increase in adult mortality sustained across decades is enough to drive a population into decline, even without any change in environmental conditions. Mammoths, mastodons and giant ground sloths fit this profile precisely. Their reproductive biology, inferred from comparison with living relatives, and from what fossil growth records preserve, suggests that losing even a small number of breeding adults per year to human hunters could have reversed population trends that had been stable for centuries. Against this, the climate hypothesis observes that the Younger Dryas itself was a profound ecological disruption entirely capable of pushing stressed populations over the edge without any assistance from human hunters. The grassland and steppe ecosystems that had supported the megafauna's enormous biomass were not static. As the climate oscillated in the centuries surrounding 12,800 years ago, plant communities shifted grassland on, giving way to shrublands in some regions, forests advancing into former open country in others, wetlands draining or flooding or reorganizing entirely. Animals adapted to wide open plains with continuous access to specific forage species found themselves navigating a patchwork landscape where suitable habitat had become fragmented and unpredictable. The buffet that had sustained their numbers for millennia was being piece by piece cleared away. Calves and juveniles, always the most vulnerable to nutritional stress, would have been the first to suffer. Birth rates would have fallen, body condition would have declined across herds, populations already reduced by habitat fragmentation would have become increasingly vulnerable to disease, to drought, to the kind of bad winters that a robust population absorbs without consequence, but a depleted one cannot. The comparison with Africa is the observation that neither side of this debate can entirely dismiss. African megafauna, elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, giraffes, African lions, buffalo survived the end of the last ice age, and with exceptions driven by more recent human pressures survive today. Africa's climate also changed during the Pleistocene-Holocene transition. African ecosystems were also reorganized. The difference, many researchers argue, is time. Large mammals in Africa had been living alongside increasingly capable human hunters for hundreds of thousands of years, long enough for natural selection to favor individuals with learned avoidance behaviors, shifted activity patterns, and great awareness of the specific cues associated with human presence. The arms race between predator and prey played out over a span long enough that neither side collapsed. In North America, by contrast, the meeting between Clovis hunters and megafauna was geologically instantaneous, and it happened at a moment when the climate was already rewriting the rules of the landscape. The emerging picture for most researchers who have spent time with the evidence is not one cause or the other, but a convergence: climate stress narrowing the margins, habitat fragmentation reducing population resilience, and human hunting applying a final pressure that a healthier ecosystem might have absorbed but a compromised one could not. Where precisely those forces intersected and which of them carried the most weight in any given region or for any given species is a question the fossil record preserves in fragments rather than in full. What it does not preserve at all, and what therefore requires a different kind of evidence entirely, is whether something else was also present at that moment, something that arrived not gradually from within the system, but suddenly from somewhere very far away. The comet that may have been. In 1994, over the course of 6 days in July, astronomers around the world trained their instruments on Jupiter and watched something that had never been observed in recorded human history. Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9, a body that had been captured by Jupiter's gravity sometime into the previous decades and had been orbiting the gas giant in a slowly decaying path, had broken apart under tidal stress into a chain of more than 20 distinct fragments. Those fragments struck Jupiter in sequence, each one releasing energy that dwarfed anything in the modern human experience of catastrophe. The largest impact scar, left by a fragment designated simply as Fragment G, was wider than the entire diameter of the Earth and remained visible in Jupiter's atmosphere for weeks. Astronomers had known the impacts were coming and had prepared to observe them. The event confirmed in real time and with instruments capable of measuring it precisely that comets are fragile objects, that fragmentation under gravitational stress is not a theoretical possibility but a documented process, and that the energy released when even a fragment of a modest comet strikes a planetary body is of an order that defies easy analogy. This is the observational foundation on which the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis rests its most physically grounded argument. If a comet approaching the inner solar system, perhaps on a long elliptical orbit that brought it near Earth only once every several thousand years, had begun to fragment under the competing gravitational influences of the Sun and the large planets, the result would have been not a single coherent object, but a dispersed field of debris moving along roughly the same orbital path. If Earth in its own orbit crossed that debris field approximately 12,800 years ago, what followed would not have resembled the single clean impact that ended the Cretaceous. It would have been messier, more distributed, harder to read in the geological record, a series of events unfolding over hours or days rather than a single moment, leaving signatures scattered across a wide geographic area rather than concentrated at one point. The airburst scenario is the version of this hypothesis that most impact proponents have come to favour, partly because it resolves the most persistent objection of the absence of a confirmed crater without requiring the evidence to be hidden or destroyed. An object that explodes in the atmosphere before reaching the ground transfers its energy to the air and to the surface below through thermal radiation and shockwaves, rather than through direct physical impact. The heat pulse from a sufficiently large air burst can ignite vegetation across thousands of square miles instantaneously. The shockwave can flatten forests in the radial patterns, extending tens of kilometers from the point of maximum energy release. The vaporized material from the exploding object itself and from surface material entrained in the explosion is lofted into the upper atmosphere where it disperses, and crucially, an airburst leaves no crater. The 1908 Tunguska event, in which an object estimated at perhaps 50 to 80 meters across exploded approximately 8 kilometers above the Siberian forest, flattened more than 2,000 square kilometers of trees, and would have obliterated a city, yet left no impact structure that ground surveys could identify. Now imagine not one Tunguska, but dozens or hundreds of varying sizes distributed across the northern hemisphere over the course of a single catastrophic interval, some over open ocean, some over the Laurentide ice sheet, some over the forests and grasslands of North America and Europe. The combined thermal and atmospheric effect would have been enormous. The crater evidence would have been essentially absent. The Hiawatha structure beneath the northwest Greenland glacier added a physical dimension to this scenario that the airburster model alone could not provide. Discovered in 2015 using airborne ice-penetrating radar, and announced formally in 2018, the crater is 31 kilometers in diameter, large enough to have been produced by an iron-rich asteroid or cometary fragment approximately 1 kilometer across. Impact melt rock and shocked mineral grains retrieved from sediment downstream of the glacier confirmed that the structure is genuinely an impact crater rather than a subglacial erosion feature. The initial question of its age was complicated by the difficulty of dating material beneath 2 kilometers of ice. Using conventional methods and early analyses produced a wide range of possible ages. Some researchers argued the isotopic signatures in ice layers above the crater were consistent with an age close to 12,800 years. Others, working from different lines of evidence, placed the impact significantly earlier, perhaps 58,000 years ago, or in some analyses within the Holocene, entirely meaning after the Younger Dryas rather than at its onset. The dating question remains unresolved, which means the Hiawatha crater is simultaneously the impact hypothesis's most compelling physical evidence and its most uncertain one. What the hypothesis ultimately asks us to consider is not a single clean, easily verified event, but a class of scenario fragmented comet distributors. Impact's widespread thermal effects, atmospheric loading, that is physically plausible, has observational precedent in documented cometary fragmentation, and would produce exactly the kind of diffuse geographically spread evidence that the boundary layer contains. The platinum in the Greenland ice, the nanodiamonds in Syrian and Belgian sediments, the magnetic spherules in Arizona, the melt glass at Abu Huraira, each of these taken alone might be explained away. Taken together, distributed across the same narrow moment in time, across multiple continents, they form a pattern that some researchers find difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence or to the quieter processes of an ordinary climate transition. The pattern, as always, is the thing, and the pattern is also the problem, because pattern recognition in science, as in human cognition, generally is both the most powerful tool available and the one most vulnerable to the projection of meaning onto noise, whether the boundary layer's contents form a genuine signal, or a collection of unrelated anomalies that only appear connected when viewed through the lens of a compelling hypothesis, is precisely what the ongoing debate is working to determine. It is in this sense a debate about how we read the ground beneath our feet and what we are willing to believe it is telling us. The quiet objections. Science does not advance by accumulating confirmations, it advances more reliably and more honestly by surviving attempts at refutation, by producing claims specific enough to be tested, predictions precise enough to be checked against new data, and evidence robust enough to hold up when independent researchers with no stake in the original findings' survival go looking for the same thing in the same places with the same instruments. This is not a comfortable process, it is by design adversarial. And when the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis entered the peer-reviewed literature in 2007, what followed was not the gradual accumulation of confirmatory evidence that its proponents had hoped for. What followed within months was a systematic and in many respects highly effective attempt to dismantle it, not through dismissal but through the most demanding form of scientific engagement: replication. The nanodiamonds were the first target. Multiple independent research teams travelled to the same sites where Firestone and his colleagues had reported their findings. They collected samples using protocols designed to avoid the contamination risks that critics had identified as a potential source of false positives. They analysed those samples using the same electron microscopy and spectroscopic techniques that the original team had employed, and in a significant number of cases, they found nothing: no nanodiamonds, no unusual concentrations of exotic carbon forms, no signal distinguishable from the background chemistry of the surrounding sediment layers. This was not a single failed replication which might be attributed to sampling variation or methodological difference. Over the following years, more than a dozen independent studies reported similar results, and the pattern of failed replication began to accumulate into something that the scientific community found difficult to ignore. One paper examining the original claims in detail noted that nanodiamonds are not in fact as rare in surface sediments as the impact hypothesis assumed. They form in ordinary forest fires, they appear in volcanic ash, they can precipitate through purely geological processes in certain soil chemistry conditions. Finding them in a boundary layer does not on its own establish that the layer records an impact rather than a prolonged dry period with frequent natural fires or a phase of elevated volcanic activity, or simply the ordinary background noise of a planet that produces exotic carbon minerals through multiple pathways simultaneously. The platinum spike ran into related difficulties, though, of a different kind. Initial studies reporting elevated platinum concentrations at the Younger Dryas boundary were striking precisely because platinum's rarity in Earth's surface environment makes any anomaly statistically meaningful, or so the argument went. When other laboratories analysed samples from the same sites, using more sensitive instruments and tighter controls, some found the spike and some did not. And in several cases, what had appeared to be a dramatic anomaly in the original data resolved into normal background variation when the sample size was increased and the statistical analysis was made more rigorous. Platinum also appears in volcanic emissions, a fact that complicates its use as an unambiguous marker of extraterrestrial delivery. The Younger Dryas began during a period of elevated volcanic activity in the Northern Hemisphere, which provides at least a partial alternative explanation for trace metal anomalies that appear in sediments from the same interval. The charcoal evidence which the impact hypothesis has presented as proof of continent-wide fires ignited by thermal radiation from airbursts turned out to carry its own complications when examined without the hypothesis in mind. Widespread burning is not unusual in the Pleistocene record. Climate-driven droughts cause fires. Lightning ignites fires. Human activity, the deliberate burning of landscapes to drive game or encourage new growth, causes fires. The sediment record from the last 100,000 years contains multiple intervals of elevated charcoal concentration that no one has proposed attributing to impact events. More specifically, when researchers looked carefully at the timing of the charcoal peaks at individual sites, the synchronicity that the impact scenario requires was not clearly present. In some locations, elevated burning began centuries before the Younger Dryas cooling. In others, it continued for millennia afterward. The pattern, when examined site by site rather than in aggregate, looked less like the instantaneous signature of a single ignition event and more like the complex regionally variable history of a continent experiencing prolonged environmental stress from multiple sources at once. It may be natural, it may be chance. The discomfort is that we cannot be certain which it is. The crater problem remained the most persistent structural weakness in the hypothesis throughout this period of scrutiny. The absence of a confirmed impact structure dating to 12,800 years ago is not by itself a refutation. The airburst scenario was specifically designed to accommodate this absence, and there are genuine reasons why evidence of impacts over ice sheets or in ocean basins might not survive intact. But the explanations offered for the missing crater multiplied in ways that some critics found increasingly difficult to accept. Perhaps it hit the ice. Perhaps it exploded before impact. Perhaps the craters are there, but we have not found them yet. Perhaps the evidence melted away in the floods that followed. Each of these is individually plausible. Collectively, they begin to resemble a hypothesis that has been made unfalsifiable by successive amendment that has been insulated against each new failure of evidence by the addition of a new explanatory layer. The Hiawatha crater, when it appeared in 2018, seemed briefly to resolve this problem, but subsequent dating work has cast enough doubt on its age to prevent it from serving as the confirmation the hypothesis needed. Whether it formed at the Younger Dryas boundary tens of thousands of years before it or sometime after is still being worked out, and the working out has not so far strongly favoured the hypothesis. And yet the skeptics, for all the rigour and substance of their objections, have not fully closed the question. The platinum in the Greenland ice cores appearing in multiple independent cores at the same depth in concentrations that are difficult to attribute entirely to volcanic sources does not go away when you point out that volcanic activity was elevated at the time. The melt glass at Abu Huraira, with the formation temperatures exceeding 1,700 degrees Celsius, does not resolve neatly into ordinary burning. The geographic spread of at least some of the boundary layer's unusual contents, nanodiamonds in Syria and Belgium and California spherules in Arizona and Northern Europe, remains a pattern that the alternative explanations have not fully accounted for. A strict application of Occam's razor favours the simpler explanation, the one that requires no cosmic visitor. But simplicity is a preference, it's not a proof, and the boundary layer has not yet yielded the clean, unambiguous signal that would allow either side to declare the question settled. What remains when the objections have been heard and weighed is not a refuted hypothesis, and not a confirmed one, but a genuinely open problem, one that sits in the sediment record like a question mark, precise enough to be taken seriously, stubborn enough to resist easy resolution, and old enough that it has outlasted several rounds of certainty on both sides. The evidence from the ground has been heard. The evidence from the ocean, quieter and slower, and in some ways more fundamental, has been waiting its turn. The ocean's own machinery. There is a current moving through the Atlantic Ocean right now that has been moving in some form for millions of years. It does not appear on the surface in any way that a traveller crossing by ship would notice no visible ripple, no change in colour, no smell carried on the wind above it. It operates mostly in the deep, a slow conveyor of water so vast that its total volume dwarfs every river system on the continental surface combined. Oceanographers call it the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. And it works in simplified terms through a mechanism that is almost elegant in its simplicity. Warm, salty surface water moves northward from the tropics, releases its heat to the atmosphere as it enters higher latitudes, cools, becomes denser, and sinks into the deep ocean where it flows southward again as a slow cold undercurrent before eventually upwelling and returning to the surface to begin the cycle again. The heat it releases on its northward journey keeps Western Europe several degrees warmer than its latitude would otherwise allow moderates the climate of eastern North America and influences rainfall patterns across much of the northern hemisphere. When it runs while large parts of the world are more habitable than they would otherwise be. When it falters, the consequences reach far beyond the ocean itself. The meltwater pulse theory proposes that the Younger Dryas was at its core a story about what happens when this circulation falters, and that the mechanism behind the faltering was not a comet or an asteroid, but the physics of a warming planet's own ice, behaving exactly as warming ice eventually must. By 12,800 years ago, the great ice sheets of the last glacial maximum had been melting for thousands of years, and the meltwater they produced had not all reached the ocean. Much of it had pooled behind natural barriers of ice rock and frozen ground, forming enormous glacial lakes in the continental interior of North America. The greatest of these was Lake Agassiz, a body of water that at its maximum extent covered an area larger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. A freshwater sea held in place not by bedrock or engineered infrastructure, but by margins of ice that were themselves subject to the same slow melting that had created the lake in the first place. The ice dam that contained Lake Agassiz was in geological terms a temporary structure. It was a question not of whether it would fail, but of when and of where the water would go when it did. Fresh water and salt water do not behave identically in the ocean, and the difference between them is the hinge on which the meltwater pulse theory turns. Salt water is denser than fresh water at the same temperature, which means it sinks more readily, and the sinking of dense surface water in the North Atlantic is precisely the engine that drives the overturning circulation. Pour enough cold fresh water into the North Atlantic and you dilute the surface layer's salinity, reducing its density, making it less willing to sink. The engine that drives the circulation begins to slow. The northward transport of tropical heat weakens. Temperatures in the regions that had been warmed by that transport begin to fall not gradually as orbital forcing would produce, but quickly as the feedback between ocean circulation and atmospheric temperature tightens. Under the right conditions, climate models suggest a sufficiently large and rapid freshwater input could push the circulation across a threshold from which it does not quickly recover, locking the northern hemisphere into a new, colder state that persists until the circulation reorganizes itself and restarts. The Younger Dryas in this reading was not an intrusion from outside the Earth system. It was the Earth system's own response to a perturbation that had been building within it for centuries. The geological evidence for large-scale meltwater release around the Younger Dryas onset is real and geographically extensive. Old shorelines of Lake Agassiz mapped across the Canadian interior show abrupt drops in lake level that correspond to moments when the lake found new outlets and drained rapidly. The landscape downstream of those outlets still carries the marks of catastrophic flooding channels carved into bedrock by volumes of water that no modern river approaches, gravel deposits laid down by flows of extraordinary speed and turbidity, sediment fans spread across former floodplains with a geometry that only high-energy catastrophic discharge produces. In the sediments of the North Atlantic and the Arctic Ocean, microfossil assemblages, the preserved remains of microscopic organisms whose tolerance for salinity is well understood, show pulses of freshwater influx that correlate with the onset of the Younger Dryas cooling. The chemistry of those sediments changes in ways consistent with a sudden reduction in surface salinity, exactly as the meltwater hypothesis predicts. Ice-rafted debris fragments of continental rock carried out to sea on floating ice and dropped as the ice melted appears in layers that suggest changed patterns of sea ice formation and drift during the cold period, patterns consistent with a weakened or reorganized overturning circulation. What the meltwater theory cannot yet answer with complete precision is the exact routing and timing of the critical outburst. Reconstructions of Lake Agassiz's drainage history have proposed several possible outlets eastward through the St. Lawrence, into the North Atlantic northward through Hudson Bay, into the Arctic southward, through the Mississippi, into the Gulf of Mexico. Different studies using different proxy records and different modelling approaches have favoured different routes and different timings, and the uncertainty has not yet been resolved sufficiently to confirm that a single catastrophic outburst occurred at precisely 12,800 years ago, rather than somewhat before or after. This matters because a cause that precedes its proposed effect by several centuries is a less compelling cause than one that coincides with it exactly. The meltwater theory does not require drama to be devastating. It requires only physics, the slow filling of a lake, the quiet weakening of an ice dam, the sudden liberation of water that had been waiting, and the long cold rearrangement of an ocean that followed. Whether that rearrangement needed any additional push from any additional source is the question the next layer of evidence begins carefully to address. Abu Huraira and the evidence that travels. On the northern edge of what is now Syria in the floodplain of the Euphrates River, there is a site that archaeologists call Abu Huraira. It is not famous in the way that Stonehenge or Göbekli Tepe are famous. It does not appear on travel itineraries or in the popular imagination with any particular frequency, but among researchers who work on the transition from the last ice age to the early Holocene, it occupies a position of unusual significance. Abu Huraira was inhabited continuously across the Younger Dryas boundary, which means it preserves in its stratified layers of occupation debris a record of what life looked like before the cold came during it and after it lifted. The people who lived there were among the earliest known experimenters with the kind of intensive plant use that would eventually lead to agriculture. They were grinding wild cereals with stone tools, storing seeds, returning to the same location season after season, in a pattern of increasing sedentism that was, by 12,800 years ago, already beginning to look like something more than ordinary foraging. And then in the layer corresponding exactly to the Younger Dryas onset, the site records something that neither climate change alone nor human activity can straightforwardly explain. The material is called melt glass. It is silica, the primary component of ordinary sand that has been heated to temperatures exceeding 1,700 degrees Celsius and fused into glassy structures that retain the shape of the intense rapid heating event that formed them. Melt glass of this kind is not produced by ordinary fires which peak well below the temperatures required to fuse silica. It is not produced by the slow heat of a hearth or a kiln. It forms in nature in two known ways through lightning strikes which can produce small localized glass formations called fulgurites, and through meteorite impacts or airbursts which can produce melt glass across areas orders of magnitude larger than any lightning event. The melt glass at Abu Huraira appears embedded in building materials and occupation layers across the site not as isolated specks consistent with lightning strikes, but as a distributed presence that suggests a single high-energy thermal event affecting the site as a whole. The structures it appears in were not kilns or furnaces. They were ordinary habitations. Something had heated them briefly and intensely to temperatures that no human technology of that period could produce, and no natural process associated with ordinary climate change would generate. The Abu Huraira melt glass became one of the most discussed individual pieces of evidence in the Younger Dryas impact debate, precisely because it is difficult to reinterpret through the quieter mechanisms that skeptics had successfully applied to the nanodiamonds and the charcoal layers. The temperature threshold is not ambiguous. Silica does not approach its fusion point in a wildfire. The site is too far inland and too elevated for any coastal or river flooding event to account for it. Volcanic activity in the region does not explain it. The nearest volcanic sources are insufficiently proximate and insufficiently active at that period to have delivered surface temperatures of this magnitude to a specific archaeological site. The impact hypothesis, by contrast, predicts exactly this kind of localized high-temperature signature at sites within the thermal footprint of an airburst, the intense brief pulse of radiant energy that an atmospheric explosion releases downward, capable of flash heating, expose surfaces to extreme temperatures before the fireball dissipates and the moment passes. For the residents of Abu Huraira, had any been outdoors? Jamnaha, when the event occurred, the pulse would have been experienced not as an approaching fire, but as an instantaneous, overwhelming heat arriving from above, This detail, the directionality of the heating downward from the atmosphere rather than spreading laterally from a ground-level ignition, is one of the physical distinctions that researchers have used to argue that the Abu Huraira evidence cannot be easily reconciled with ordinary burning. Ordinary fires heat surfaces through convection and radiant transfer from ground-level or near ground-level combustion, which produces characteristic patterns of charring and heat damage that are distinct from the patterns produced by overviewed thermal radiation. The melt glass at Abu Huraira in its distribution and character has been interpreted by some researchers as more consistent with the latter. Others have challenged this interpretation, arguing that the site's own occupation history introduces enough complexity, enough burning of stored plant material, enough use of lime plaster and other processed silica-rich materials to make the temperature estimates uncertain and the impact interpretation premature. The argument, like so many arguments in this field, comes down to how much ambiguity the evidence genuinely contains and how much interpretive weight any single site can bear. What Abu Huraira contributes to the broader picture, regardless of how the melt glass debate is ultimately resolved, is a geographic anchor in the Middle East, a point on the map that extends the distribution of proposed impact signatures from North America and Northern Europe into a third continental region, and does so at a site whose stratigraphic context is unusually well documented because of the continuous human occupation that preceded and followed the Younger Dryas onset. The layer that contains the melt glass is not isolated or ambiguous in its dating. It sits between occupation phases whose timing is constrained by multiple independent lines of chronological evidence. The people who were living at Abu Huraira before the cold came left a material record of their activities. The people who were living there after the cold came left a different material record reflecting the dietary and behavioral adjustments that the changed climate required. And precisely at the boundary between those two records, there is a layer that contains material formed at temperatures that ordinary life in an early Holocene settlement does not produce. The Natufian communities of the Levant Abu Huraira, among them, were at this moment in history conducting what might be described as an extended multi-generational experiment in the relationship between people and plants. They were not yet farmers, but they were becoming something more than ordinary foragers developing a knowledge of cereal biology and seasonal availability that would eventually, after the Younger Dryas had run its course, and the climate had stabilized, become the foundation of deliberate cultivation. Whether the event recorded in the Abu Huraira melt glass disrupted this experiment, accelerated it, or simply marked one particularly intense moment in a transition that was already underway, is a question the site's archaeology preserves without fully answering. What it does preserve without ambiguity is the record of a moment when something extraordinary happened here, and when the people who survived it, whatever it was, continued as people do to live in the same place and to carry what they knew forward into a world that had briefly violently become unrecognizable. The traces left by that moment extend in the evidentiary record well beyond the Euphrates Valley, and the path they follow leads eventually back to the ice. The people who remained. A Clovis point held in the hand is a disorienting object. Not because it is large, most are between 2 and 5 inches long, but because the precision it embodies is so complete that the gap between its maker and the person holding it collapses in a way that older cruder tools do not produce. The fluting that runs up each face, removing a thin channel of stone from base to midpoint, required a controlled, confident strike that could shatter the entire piece if applied with even slightly wrong force or angle. Knappers who have dedicated years to learning Paleo-Indian stoneworking techniques describe the fluted Clovis point as among the most technically demanding objects in the entire human lithic record. A form that required not only skill, but a specific transmissible knowledge of how particular stone types behave under percussion, how temperature and humidity affect the material's fracture dynamics. How to read the grain of a nodule before committing to the first strike. To make a Clovis point well, you needed to have learned from someone who could make one well. The technology was not reinvented independently in each generation. It was taught, refined, and passed forward through networks of instruction that constituted, in the absence of written language, one of the most sophisticated knowledge transmission systems the Americas had yet produced. And then at the Younger Dryas boundary it stops appearing in new sediment layers, not everywhere at once and not without regional variation, but they're the classic Clovis toolkit, the fluted point in particular, the specific hafting technology. The standardized approach to lithic reduction that had spread from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic in what appears to have been a remarkably short period fades from the archaeological record at almost exactly the moment when the climate collapses. What follows is a period that is, in the archaeological sense, quieter. Fewer sites, thinner occupation layers, a patchwork of regional tool traditions, replacing the relative continental uniformity of the Clovis horizon. The silence is not absolute. People did not disappear from North America, but the particular cultural coherence that Clovis represents, the shared technology, the implied networks of context and exchange, the confidence of a population that had found a way of living that worked across an enormous range of environments, gives way to something more fragmented, more locally adapted, more varied in its solutions to the problem of survival, in a world that had abruptly changed its terms. The Folsom tradition, which emerges in the Great Plains during or shortly after the Younger Dryas, is sometimes described as Clovis's successor, but the description understates the difference between them. Folsom points are thinner, more delicately worked, and fluted for a greater proportion of their length than Clovis points, technically more demanding in some respects, suggesting that the napping tradition did not simply degrade under pressure, but was actively refined and redirected. The prey had changed too. Folsom hunters were targeting a different species of bison, a somewhat smaller and faster animal than the megafaunal forms that Clovis hunters had pursued alongside mammoths and mastodons. The hunting technology adapted to the hunting context, which is precisely what you would expect from a population under pressure, not the abandonment of skill, but its reorientation toward whatever the landscape still offered. In the northeastern woodlands, different post-Clovis traditions developed around different resource bases, more riverine and lacustrine subsistence, more emphasis on plant foods and smaller game, a diversification of the toolkit that reflects diversification of the diet. Along the Pacific coast, maritime resources appear to have sustained populations through the cold period with comparatively less disruption, the ocean's thermal inertia buffering coastal environments against the worst of the continental temperature swings. The Paisley Caves in south-central Oregon offer one of the most useful single-site windows into human continuity across the Younger Dryas boundary. The caves, dry and stratified, preserve organic material in unusual detail. Plant remains animal bones. Human coprolites preserved ancient feces and stone tools in a sequence that spans from before the Younger Dryas onset through its duration and into the subsequent Holocene warming. The occupation record does not go silent at 12,800 years ago. People were in the Paisley Caves before the cold, during it, and after it, and the changes in the material they left behind across that span record the adjustments they made in real time, shifts in the species they were hunting and gathering, changes in the plant foods represented in dietary remains, modifications to tool forms that track changing resource availability. The caves are not evidence that the Younger Dryas Heliocalypsos had no effect on the people living in their vicinity. The record shows change, but it is the change of adaptation, not of collapse, a community bending under pressure rather than breaking. The contrast between sites that go quiet at the Younger Dryas boundary and sites like Paisley Caves that continue through it may reflect genuine regional variation in the severity of the event's effects, or variation in the strategies that different human communities had developed before the cold arrived, or both. Populations already organized around diversified subsistence, multiple food sources, flexible seasonal movement knowledge of fallback resources would have been better positioned to absorb the disruption than populations that had specialized heavily around the megafaunal hunting that the Clovis tradition's most visible sites document. Specialization is efficient in a stable environment. It becomes a liability when the environment that the specialization was calibrated to ceases to exist. In this light, the end of Clovis reads not as the erasure of a people, but as the obsolescence of a strategy, a particular set of solutions to a particular set of conditions, overtaken by conditions that required different solutions. The people who had made Clovis points did not vanish from the continent. Their descendants, genetic and cultural, became the Folsom hunters, the Pacific coast fisherfolk, the Great Basin foragers, the eastern woodland communities whose diversified subsistence carried them through the longest cold and into a warmer world on the other side. The knowledge they preserved through the Younger Dryas, imperfect, adaptive, regionally varied, was the seed from which every subsequent chapter of North American human prehistory grew. Whether the event that forced this transformation arrived from space, from the ocean, or from the slow convergence of climate pressures already in motion is a question those communities could not have formulated and would not have needed to answer. They only needed to survive it, and in enough places and in enough numbers they did. The Near East in the cold, the survivors of the Younger Dryas in North America were not the only people navigating a world that had reorganized itself without warning. On the other side of the planet, in the hill country and river valleys of the eastern Mediterranean, a different set of communities was experiencing the same cold snap through a different ecological lens, with consequences that would ultimately reshape the entire trajectory of human civilization in ways that no Clovis hunter on the Great Plains could have anticipated or recognized. The Natufian people of the Levant, named for Wadi el Natuf in the hills west of the Jordan River, where their remains were first systematically studied, had by 12,800 years ago developed a way of life that was by the standards of the late Pleistocene unusually settled. They were not farmers, but they were no longer fully nomadic foragers either, and the distinction matters enormously for understanding what the Younger Dryas did to them, and what they in response eventually did to the world. The Natufian communities had been exploiting wild cereals, primarily wild emmer wheat and wild barley, with an intensity that went well beyond casual harvesting. They had developed flint-bladed sickles, their edges still carrying the characteristic silica sheen that forms when a blade is used repeatedly to cut grass stems. They had built and used large stone mortars and grinding slabs, heavier movable equipment, the kind that only makes sense for a community that expects to return to the same location season after season. They stored food. They buried their dead in formal cemeteries adjacent to their settlements, an investment in place that implies a relationship with specific locations lasting longer than a single season's visit. At sites like Ain Malaha in northern Israel, Natufian communities had constructed circular stone-walled structures substantial enough to have required planned collective labour. These were not temporary camps. They were by the standards of the time something approaching villages, the earliest experiments in what would eventually become sedentary life conducted by people who had not yet made the conceptual or practical leap to deliberate cultivation, but had come closer to that leap than anyone before them. Then the Younger Dryas arrived, and the eastern Mediterranean became drier and colder. The rainfall patterns that had supported the dense stands of wild cereals in the hill country shifted. The wild grain harvests became less reliable, less abundant, less predictable from year to year. The resource base that had made Natufian sedentism possible, the concentrated, dependable productivity of wild cereal stands within walking distance of a permanent settlement, was no longer delivering what it had delivered before the cold. Some Natufian communities responded by contracting, abandoning larger, more elaborate settlements in favour of smaller, more mobile occupation patterns that reduced their dependence on any single location's productivity. The archaeological record shows a reduction in site size and elaboration in some areas during the coldest centuries of the Younger Dryas, a pulling back from the investments in permanent infrastructure that had characterized the preceding warm phase. The experiment in settled life, it appeared, was being interrupted by climate forcing it had not been designed to withstand. But the knowledge did not disappear with the settlements. The Natufian community says that moved more frequently during the Younger Dryas carried with them an accumulated understanding of cereal biology that no amount of climatic disruption could erase which species grew where, how their yields varied with rainfall and temperature, how long harvested grain could be stored and under what conditions, how to process it efficiently with the tools they had developed over generations of intensive use. This knowledge was embodied not only in individual memory, but in the physical form of the tools themselves, the sickle blades, the grinding equipment, the storage vessels which persisted in the archaeological record, even as settlement patterns shifted and contracted. When the Younger Dryas ended approximately 11,600 years ago, and the eastern Mediterranean climate warmed and moistened again, the wild cereals recovered. And now there were people in the landscape who understood those plants with an intimacy born of millennia of careful observation, forced to its sharpest edge by 1,000 years of scarcity. The transition to deliberate cultivation that followed the Younger Dryas in the Near East was not a single invention occurring at a single moment in a single place. It was a process distributed distributed across multiple communities and multiple generations, in which the line between intensive harvesting of wild plants and deliberate encouragement of preferred varieties was crossed repeatedly in different ways in different locations until the crossing had become irreversible. Domesticated wheat and barley plants whose seed dispersal mechanisms had been altered by the selective pressure of repeated human harvesting so that they retained their seeds on the stalk rather than scattering them begin to appear in the archaeological record within a few centuries of the Younger Dryas's end. The communities that produced them were the cultural descendants of the Natufian people who had survived the cold. The knowledge that made domestication possible was the knowledge that the cold had tested and preserved. In this sense, the Younger Dryas was not simply a disruption to the trajectory toward agriculture. It may have been in a compressed and painful way one of its causes, a pressure that selected for the communities most deeply invested in plant knowledge and forced that knowledge to its most practical application. Göbekli Tepe. The monumental stone enclosure constructed in southeastern Turkey beginning around 11,500 years ago, just as the Younger Dryas was ending, stands as the most architecturally dramatic evidence of what the communities that emerged from the cold had become. The people who built it were still, by conventional definition, hunter-gatherers. The site predates confirmed agriculture in the region by at least several centuries. Yet they were capable of quarrying, shaping and erecting limestone pillars weighing up to 20 tons, arranging them in precise circular enclosures decorated with carved reliefs of animals, and doing so apparently without the organisational infrastructure of a settled agricultural economy. Whatever drew these communities together to build Göbekli Tepe ritual cosmology, the negotiation of relationships between groups whose ranges overlapped in the resource-rich hill country of the northern Fertile Crescent, it required a level of social coordination and logistical capacity that the world before the Younger Dryas had not demonstrably produced. Whether the cold itself and the pressures it imposed contributed to the development of those capacities is a question that archaeologists are still working through. What the Near Eastern record adds to the Younger Dryas story when set alongside the North American evidence is a sense of the event's reach, not just geographic, not just climatic, but civilizational. The same cold that ended the Clovis world and emptied grasslands of their megafauna also interrupted the first experiments in sedentary life in the region that would eventually produce cities writing and the agricultural economies that feed most of humanity today. It did not prevent those developments. It may in its way have sharpened them, and it did so without caring in any meaningful sense what it was interrupting, which is perhaps the most unsettling thing the Younger Dryas has to tell us about the relationship between human ambition and the climate system it depends upon. The question of what triggered the cold, whether it came from the sky or from the ocean or from the grinding interior logic of a planet transitioning between glacial states, does not change what the cold did to the people who lived through it, but it changes considerably what we should take from it as we look at the world they left behind. What the evidence allows. One of the more useful instruments in the current investigation of the Younger Dryas boundary is not a telescope or a drill, but a refinement of a technique that has existed for decades, radiocarbon dating, recalibrated against tree ring chronologies and coral records to produce calibration curves of increasing precision. The older versions of radiocarbon dating carried uncertainty windows wide enough that events separated by several centuries could appear in the data to be simultaneous, or that events that were genuinely simultaneous could appear to be separated by intervals long enough to suggest independent causes. The newer calibration curves, developed and revised continuously by international consortia of researchers working with archives of known age organic material, have narrowed those uncertainty windows considerably in the period around the Younger Dryas onset. This narrowing matters because the central question about the boundary layer's unusual contents, whether they record a single synchronous event or a collection of unrelated anomalies spread across centuries, is precisely the kind of question that turns on the resolution of the dating. If the platinum spike and the nano diamonds and the melt glass and the charcoal peaks can be shown with the new precision to fall within the same decade, the case for a common cause becomes substantially stronger. If they cannot, if the tighter dating spreads them further apart rather than pulling them together, the case for coincidence becomes correspondingly more compelling. The current state of the dating assessed across the body of literature produced in the decade following the initial controversy does not deliver a clean verdict in either direction. Some sites show a tighter clustering of anomalous signals around 12,800 years ago when the new calibration curves are applied. Others show the opposite anomalies that appeared to be synchronous in earlier analyses turn out with finer resolution to be separated by enough time to complicate a single event interpretation. The pattern that emerges from the aggregate, if it can be called a pattern, is one of genuine ambiguity, not the clean refutation that the hypothesis's most determined critics had hoped for, and not the confirmation that its proponents continued to seek. The evidence at this level of resolution remains open to more than one reading, and the researchers doing the reading remain on the whole honestly divided about what it means. What has shifted in the years since the initial heated exchange of papers and counterpapers is the tone of the debate more than its fundamental structure. The early years of the controversy were marked by a sharpness of disagreement that sometimes made the scientific literature read more like adversarial correspondence than collaborative inquiry. Claimers were met with refutations framed in unusually direct language, accusations of methodological error shaded in some cases into accusations of something closer to motivated reasoning. The sociology of the argument was for a period nearly as interesting as its substance. The more recent literature is calmer, more precisely calibrated in its claims, more careful in distinguishing between what the evidence establishes and what it merely suggests, more willing to acknowledge that the honest answer to the central question is still provisionally that we do not know. This is not the resolution that either side would have chosen, but it is arguably the most scientifically productive outcome the controversies could have produced short of definitive proof, a sharpening of the questions, a raising of the evidentiary standards, and a recognition that the problem is harder and more interesting than either camp's initial position had allowed. The analytical chemistry available to researchers working on the boundary layer has also advanced significantly. Instruments capable of measuring platinum and related platinum group elements at parts per trillion concentrations, sensitivities that were not routinely available to the teams that conducted the initial studies, have allowed more precise characterization of the trace element signatures in boundary layer samples. This matters because the argument about whether the platinum spike reflects extraterrestrial delivery or volcanic emission turns in part on the ratio of platinum to other platinum group elements. Different source materials produce characteristic ratios, and the ratios in the boundary layer samples are in the most recent analyses more consistent with some extraterrestrial compositions than with the volcanic sources proposed as alternatives. This is not proof. Ratios are statistical tendencies, not unique fingerprints, and the relevant compositional space is large enough to accommodate uncertainty. But the direction of the finding is not neutral, and the researchers who have produced it are not advocates for the impact hypothesis, they are analysts reporting what their instruments returned. The broader scientific community's posture toward the hypothesis, having moved from initial excitement through sharp skepticism, has settled into something that might be described as cautious agnosticism, with a slight lean toward the possibility that something unusual did occur at the boundary, even if its nature and scale remain uncertain. Major review papers now tend to acknowledge that the complete dismissal of the impact hypothesis that characterized the skeptical response of the early 2000s was itself too strong, that the evidence properly examined does not support confident refutation any more than it supports confident confirmation. The Hiawatha crater remains an open variable. Subsequent work has narrowed its probable age range, but has not definitively excluded the Younger Dryas onset as a possibility, and the detailed analysis of its impact to melt materials continues. If its age is eventually constrained to within a few centuries of 12,800 years ago, the evidentiary landscape will shift considerably. If it is confirmed as significantly older or younger, one of the hypothesis's most physically tangible anchors will be removed. What all of this leaves at the current moment in the investigation is a question that is simultaneously more specific and more open than it was when Richard Firestone's team first published in 2007. More specific because the decades of argument have clarified exactly what evidence would be required to resolve it, what dating precision, what spatial distribution, what chemical fingerprint, what physical structure, and have produced methods capable of pursuing that evidence with real rigor. More open because the pursuit has not yet closed the case, and because the boundary layer continues to return anomalies that the simpler explanations have not fully absorbed. The evidence that something unusual happened at 12,800 years ago is not in serious dispute. The evidence for what that something was remains with honesty unfinished, and unfinished questions in science, as in most things, are not failures. They are invitations to return to the archive to drill deeper, to apply the next instrument to the next sample, and read with care whatever the record has been waiting to say. The long patience of the record. There is a particular quality to questions that have not yet been answered, a quality different from the frustration of a problem that resists solution, and different again from the comfort of mystery that was never meant to be solved. The Younger Dryas sits in neither of those categories. It is not intractable. The evidence exists, distributed across ice cores and lake sediments, and archaeological sites and ocean floors, waiting with the particular patience of material things for the instruments and methods capable of reading it precisely enough. Nor is it a mystery that science has chosen to leave romantically unresolved content with the productive ambiguity of an open question. It is rather a problem at the edge of current resolution, close enough to the boundary of what careful inquiry can establish that each new study moves the needle however slightly, and the direction it moves matters. This is science working at the pace that difficult problems genuinely require, which is slower than headlines suggest and more interesting conclusions alone would indicate. What the Younger Dryas is already that's regardless of how its triggering mechanism is eventually characterized, is a picture of climate fragility that the geological record makes vivid in ways that abstract models cannot quite replicate. A planet that had been warming steadily for 5,000 years reversed course in what the ice records as a human lifetime. Ecosystems that had been tracking the warming northward species by species and community by community found themselves trying to reverse direction at a pace that some could manage and some could not. Populations of large, slow-reproducing animals that had survived dozens of previous climate oscillations encountered this one in the additional presence of a new predator, clever coordinated, capable of transmitting hunting strategies across generations faster than prey species could evolve, defensive behaviors, and did not survive the combination. Human cultures that had developed sophisticated, specialized solutions to the late Pleistocene environment found those solutions suddenly miscalibrated and responded with the flexibility that has always been the species' most reliable survival trait. They changed what they were doing, diversified their strategies, retained what knowledge they could, and carried it forward into a world that the cold had remade. The megafauna whose bones now rest in museum cases and research collections were not simply unlucky. They were the product of millions of years of evolutionary refinement exquisitely adapted to a world that ceased within the span of centuries to exist. The Columbian mammoth's tusks, those 16-foot instruments of bark stripping and snow clearing, were solutions to problems that the new climate and the new human presence made irrelevant. The short-faced bear's long-running adapted legs built for pursuing prey across open steppe had no adequate answer to a landscape fragmented into forest and shrubland and managed by human hunters who did not need to outrun anything. The saber-toothed cat's precision killing apparatus, refined over millions of years to take large prey cleanly and efficiently, became a liability when the large prey disappeared. These were not failures of adaptation. They were adaptations overtaken by a pace of change that adaptation working at the speed of natural selection could not match. The record of their disappearance is not a story of weakness. It is a story of speed. The human communities that came through the Younger Dryas in North America were in the Near East, along coastlines and river valleys, and in cave systems that buffered the worst of the temperature extremes carried forward something that bones and tools preserve only imperfectly, the accumulated knowledge of how to live in a world that does not stay the same. The Natufian communities who emerged from the cold with their serial knowledge, sharpened by 1,000 years of scarcity, did not invent agriculture because they were smarter than their predecessors. They invented it because the cold had forced their relationship with plants to a level of intimacy and dependence that when the warmth returned and the wild stands recovered, expressed itself naturally as the next step as deliberate planting, selective harvesting, the slow reshaping of plant biology by sustained human attention. The fulsome hunters who refined the Clovis tradition under pressure produced a stoneworking tradition, in some ways more technically demanding than what they had inherited. Pressure in the human case does not reliably produce collapse. It reliably produces adaptation, and adaptation sustained across enough generations produces invention. The current generation of researchers working on the Younger Dryas boundary is operating with tools that would have seemed extraordinary to the scientists who first identified the cold period in the 1930s. Ice-penetrating radar, capable of mapping structures buried beneath 2 miles of glacier mass. Spectrometers sensitive enough to distinguish between platinum of terrestrial and extraterrestrial origin, at concentrations measured in parts per trillion climate models that can simulate the response of the Atlantic circulation to freshwater pulses of specified volume and duration, radiocarbon calibration curves precise enough to distinguish events separated by decades rather than centuries. These tools have not resolved the central question, but they have narrowed it, specified it, made it more answerable in principle, even as it has proven more resistant to answering in practice than the field's early optimism suggested. The next generation of tools ground penetrating surveys of subglacial terrain, not yet imaged deep ocean cores from regions not yet sampled, isotopic analyses of boundary layer materials from sites not yet excavated, will narrow it further. Whether they will close it is genuinely unknown, and the genuine unknowing is part of what makes the investigation worth following. The thin stripe of sediment that sits in dozens of archives around the northern hemisphere, at the depth corresponding to 12,800 years ago, is still there. It has been there since it was deposited layer by patient layer, across an interval that saw the world change faster than the world had changed in thousands of years before it. It contains in its chemistry and its microscopic structures and its trace element profiles a record of whatever happened during that interval. A record precise enough to have sustained decades of scientific argument, and diffuse enough to have resisted so far definitive reading. It will continue to be sampled, analysed, reanalyzed and argued over for as long as researchers have access to it and a reason to believe it has not yet given up everything it holds. The mammoth herds are gone. The Clovis world is gone. The particular configuration of ice and ocean and atmosphere that defined the late Pleistocene is gone, replaced by the Holocene conditions in which all of recorded human history has occurred. But the questions those vanishings generate remain very much present patient-specific, and waiting as evidence tends to wait for the moment when the right instrument meets the right sample, and the record finally says something that everyone in the room can agree they have heard. That moment has not yet arrived. The record is still speaking, and we are still carefully learning to listen. She is still there, in a sense, that woman on the edge of the Great Plains processing a hide in the thin light of a morning that preceded everything we have spent this night following. She does not know what the ice to the north contains. She does not know that a layer of sediment is being laid down grain by grain in lakes and bogs and cave floors across the northern hemisphere, a layer that will sit undisturbed for 12 millennia here, before someone with a drill and a mass spectrometer thinks to ask what it holds. She knows the cold. She knows the herd movements and the quality of the flint from the quarry 3 days' walk to the east and the way the light changes in the weeks before the hardest frost. She knows what she needs to know, and it is enough for now to be enough. That is where we started. That is in some sense where we have arrived again, not with an answer, but with a clearer sense of the shape of the question. The Younger Dryas is not a mystery that rewards impatience. It is the kind of problem that the Earth tends to pose, layered, imprecise at the edges, rich with detail in its centre, and frustratingly vague at its boundaries, requiring instruments that sometimes do not yet exist, and demanding a patience that the human appetite for resolution finds difficult to sustain. The platinum is real, the melt glass is real, the cold was real, and the speed of it was real, and the silence that fell over the Clovis world at its onset is a silence the archaeological record has preserved with unusual fidelity. What caused the cold, what specifically tipped a warming planet back into a millennium of ice, remains at this moment genuinely open in ways that are not rhetorical or performative but simply honest. Science, working carefully at the boundary of what it can currently measure, has not yet found the clean signal that would allow anyone to say with confidence here, this was the thing, this was the moment, this was the mechanism that broke the world's thermostat and sent the mammoths and the Clovis hunters into their respective kinds of darkness. There is in that incompleteness something worth sitting with rather than resolving. The sediment record is patient in a way that human inquiry is not. It has been holding whatever it holds for 12,000 years, and will hold it for 12,000 more if the instruments never come. The ice cores, the lake muds, the charred layers beneath Syrian occupation floors, none of them are waiting for us. They simply are dense with information indifferent to the urgency of our curiosity. We are the ones who came to them with our drills and our spectrometers, and our arguments asking a question that the material world encoded long before we were here to ask it. Whether we are reading that encoding correctly is in the end what the debate is about. Not the event itself, which happened as it happened completely and irreversibly, but our capacity to reconstruct it from what survives. And perhaps that is enough to carry into sleep, not a conclusion, but a posture, the willingness to hold an open question without requiring it to sit with the not yet knowing, the way a researcher sits with a core sample that has not yet been analysed, aware that it contains something uncertain, trusting the process more than the outcome. Somewhere in the sediment of a lake bed that no one has drilled yet, the answer may already be there. Preserved in chemistry, waiting in darkness, patient as ice. Rest now, dreamer, the record will keep. The questions that have waited 12,000 years can wait one more night, and the morning will find them exactly where you left them, layered, unresolved, and no less worth asking for. Having been set down for a few quiet hours in the dark, let the boundary layer settle. Let the ocean currents move at their own pace through their own depths. Let the ice cores hold whatever they hold. You do not need to carry the Younger Dryas into sleep with you. It is old enough and heavy enough to rest on its own. The cold that fell on that ancient world has long since lifted. What remains is only light and the slow turning of a planet that has survived stranger things than any of us will live to see. Sleep well. The mammoths have been gone for 12 millennia. And the grass grew back and the world continued. And here you are at the far end of all of it, breathing quietly in the dark, which is in its own way a kind of answer.